Hello there. My name is Danny Parker. I'm a historian who's been researching World War II for the last 40 years of my life. And I'm going to talk to you today about the Battle of the Bulge, which was a very important event within the Second World War in Europe. And I want to take you through that and help you understand exactly what happened and why it was important and what it means today for us. So let's go back to let's try to turn the clock back 70 years ago, so that we're looking at what was going on in Europe during the 1940s. Of course, after the U.S. Army landed at Normandy on D-Day on June 6, 1944. They began to collapse the German defense in France and then to liberate Europe from Hitler's conquest of Europe during 1940 in the West. And so the German army actually collapsed in August of 1944 and then fled back to the German border in the fall. During the autumn, the Allied commanders that were in charge of the U.S. forces were trying to find a way to end the war quickly. And so one of the ideas that was held by the British commander, Sir Bernard Montgomery, was the idea of a parachute operation that would seize Rhine bridges and allow forces to then reach deep into Germany in early September of 1944 while the German forces were fleeing France, and to end the war quickly thereafter. Unfortunately, this operation, while audacious, eventually failed because of the difficulty of maintaining a large number of supply lines across multiple bridges to reach the Rhine. And so by mid-September, that operation had eventually ended in failure, or at least certainly not success. And the Allied commander at that point was the supreme commander of Allied forces, including British and American forces, was General Dwight D. Eisenhower. And he, after the failure of what was called Operation Market Garden, which was the attempt to seize those Rhine bridges and end the war quickly, then Eisenhower moved back to a strategy of slowly pushing the Germans back towards the interior of Germany and eventually moving into Germany and ending the war. And the question was, how long would that take to be accomplished? And the early news in the autumn of 1944 was not good. You had General George S. Patton, the audacious Third Army commander down in the south in the Lorraine area, who was attacking there to try to push the Germans back. And then you have also Allied Northern Command, which included General Hodges of the First Army, attacking up in the north in the Hürtgen Forest area, a very densely wooded zone before the Rhine. Both those commanders, both Hodges and Patton, were attempting to force the Germans back, and were finding it very difficult to do because the Germans appeared to had plenty of fight left in them, and the battles that occurred during the autumn of 1944 were reminiscent of World War I. So they featured a lot of artillery and very heavy casualties on both sides, and lots of losses and suffering, and without a lot of movement. And so it looked like, whereas there had been hopes that the war could be over by Christmas time, it really looked in the autumn of 1944 as if that was not going to happen. In fact, Eisenhower had a bet with Montgomery that they would win by Christmas time. And in this case, Eisenhower had lost that bet. And so he had hoped that the war would be over sooner, but it looked like it was going to drag on. But it still looked like, even though there were a large number of losses for the Allied forces, it still looked like that the Germans were being pressed on both sides. And of course, we haven't mentioned that in Russia, the Soviet forces were pushing hard on the German armies that were in the eastern zone. And that was a tremendous battle. And it was also one that the Germans were losing. They were being ground down. And Adolf Hitler, the dictator and leader of not National Socialist Germany, could see that there was no way that he could intervene on the Eastern Front against Stalin and the Soviets and have any way of trying to help himself to end the war more favorably. However, he did have the idea that the Allied forces in the West were not getting along all that well. That is, that the British forces and the American forces were there was some friction, and there was some fractious nature to that relationship. And he felt that he felt the Americans were weak, and that the Americans were not particularly good fighters, and that if he could strike a very heavy blow against the American forces somehow, that it might be possible to sue for a separate peace between the British and the Americans, and then turn his attention to the Soviets in the East. And so that was, even while the German forces were collapsing in August 1944 in France, he confided to his chief of armed operations, Alfred Jodl. He felt that there might be a possibility of launching an offensive against the Americans that could really turn the tide of the war. And they noted even by the beginning of September, before the paratroop operation Market Garden assailed them, even before that, they noticed that the Americans seemed to be defending the Ardennes zone, which is a heavily forested area south of the Hurtgen, along the Ur River in Belgium and Luxembourg. They noted that looked like that area was being defended lightly. And the reason it was being defended lightly was the Americans were trying to attack both north in the Hurtgen area and south in the Lorraine area with Patton. And so you can't be strong everywhere. So they had the terrain in the Ardennes was hilly, kind of reminiscent of New England, and self-defensive, very difficult physical terrain in that zone. And so the Americans felt like that you didn't really need to defend it very heavily, because the Germans were highly unlikely to attempt any kind of attack there, because it was so difficult. The terrain was so difficult. So the Americans chose to defend that area lightly, and it became known as the Ghost Front. And why was it called the Ghost Front? Because there's not much really happening there, and it was an area where the Americans were bringing in divisions that had been ground down in the Hurtgen or in the Lorraine and Patton's operations for rest and rehabilitation, for relaxation, for replacement, for refurbishment. And so the Ardennes was known as kind of a recreation zone, frankly, for the American forces. It was where you wanted to be, because you were, even though the Germans were along the Ur River, and they were, the Americans could see them in the hills separating them from the German border there. So the Ur River formed the border between Germany and Belgium and Luxembourg. And even though they could see the German forces on the other side, both sides were really not shooting much at each other. I mean, there were patrols and operations of that sort, but not a lot of real military operations. And so it was a quiet area. And so Hitler was looking at this like this might be an area where he could attack, however, because it was being defended very lightly. he reached back into history to consider launching an attack in this zone. That's because in May 1940, when he had attacked through Belgium, he had come primarily through the Ardennes and surprised the Belgians and the French by coming through that area in May 1940. And of course, spring, summer weather, but they had come through that area and had shown that you could drive through that area because the Belgians had defended it very lightly in 1940. And so Hitler had attacked through that area. But the Americans still had more presence in the Ardennes than the Belgians had in 1940. So this area was not defended that lightly. So the Eisenhower felt it was, and General Omar Bradley, in charge of the U.S. 12th Army Group in Luxembourg City, controlling all the armies on the Western Front, they felt that it was highly unlikely that Hitler was going to attack in the Ardennes. So it was a good area for dividing the operations north and south, and as well as for refurbishing worn-down divisions. Hitler, on the other hand, was looking at he didn't want to attract any more attention to the Ardennes because he was looking at perhaps he could launch another big attack, a final big attack in the Ardennes, and split the American forces from the British and dash quickly to the Belgian port of Antwerp on the coast. There weren't a lot of deep water ports at this point, Cherbourg and Antwerp being those mainly. And so if he could seize that port on the Belgian coast, it would leave large chunks of the Allied forces without supply, and they would be in terrible trouble, and it would certainly delay the progress of the war by months. And he had hoped that it would be so serious that it would result in the sack of Eisenhower and Montgomery, and that it would go all the way back to Roosevelt and Churchill in terms of the catastrophe on the Western Front. And perhaps then he could sue for a separate peace in the West, and then turn his attention to Stalin on the Eastern Front in Russia. Of course, this was probably highly unlikely, but in Hitler's mind, he was searching for any possible solution to the fact that he was fighting a war on two fronts and losing. So all through the autumn of 1944, while the Allies were attacking both in the Hurtgen area and then also in the Lorraine area with Patton, Hitler was planning this operation, and it was going to be called Wacht am Rhein, after an old German anthem. That was his code name, and it was Hitler had felt that somehow or other, all in the summer of 1944, all of his operations, whatever he was planning, was somehow getting to the Allies. They were somehow knowing what he was going to do before he was doing it. And he felt that he had a spy within his organization. And in fact, on July 20th, 1944, some of his own officers had attempted his assassination at his headquarters in East Prussia. So he had real reason to suspect that there was a spy inside that was providing information about what his plans were. So this plan for this secret operation, the secret big attack in the Ardennes, was very closely guarded, and the word was kept within a very small circle of individuals. And in fact, if you were brought in to knowledge of Wacht am Rhein, of this operation that was this big attack that was going to happen in the Ardennes, and word escaped, you knew that you could be shot, you die. So anyway, it was very closely guarded. What Hitler didn't know was that in some really amazing code-breaking work using the very first electromechanical computers designed on the planet, the British had broken the German military code called Enigma. That was the name of the code. And it was so complicated and it was changed so often that it felt that it was impossible to break it. That there was no way that that code was absolutely safe. You could use it and it was inviolate. You would not be able to know what the Germans were doing because the code was changed frequently. You wouldn't be able to read it. But in fact, the British at Bletchley Park had in fact found a way using, like I said, very crude, very large electromechanical computers that had been conceived by Turing to be able to break the German code. And they were doing it regularly. They were breaking the German code daily. And they knew what Hitler was planning in the summer of 1944. But then the problem began, which is if you know what the enemy is going to do, should you telegraph that by always responding? And so they were very careful about using the most secret of secrets. But because Hitler suspected he had a spy, Enigma dried up. So Enigma said, even though Enigma was that codes were providing lots of information to Eisenhower and Montgomery in the fall of 1944, it was not providing any information about Bogdan Ryan about this plan. Why? Because Hitler had suspected that someone on his own staff was leaking information. So Enigma had no information about this at all. So even though there was conventional intelligence that showed that it looked like that the Germans were some unusual things were happening east of the Ardennes area in Belgium and Luxembourg. It looked like forces were being massed in November, late November and early December 1944. Even though that was happening, it tended to be discounted because the intelligence people, the G2s, with the 12th Army Group, with the U.S. 12th Army Group, and then also the 21st Army Group with Montgomery, they believed that if there was something really going on, Enigma would tell them. And Enigma had never, or that the code breaking had never failed them. They had always they had always been able to know what the Germans were going to do before they did it. So it was a case where the code breaking actually misled the Allied forces into a confidence to discount conventional intelligence, where they were finding, aerial reconnaissance showing increased concentrations of locomotives bringing in troops, or tanks concentrating in the Eifel region, which is a hilly region in Germany that just across from the Ardennes in Belgium. So that was discounted. But in fact, Hitler had originally planned to launch this operation to knife through American forces in the Ardennes and reach Antwerp and do it in 4 days. It wouldn't, they would accumulate the fuel, the equipment, the divisions, and so forth. They would provide their latest tanks, a huge concentration of artillery, and a final concentration of aircraft from the Luftwaffe, from the German Air Force, and they would attack. And originally, they had planned to do that on the 10th of December, 1944, but the schedule slipped, and it actually slipped to December 16th. And the main reason it slipped was because of fuel deliveries. Fuel was very difficult to come by because of the effectiveness of the Allied air campaign at going after the petroleum stocks, the limited petroleum stocks that the German army had. But in secret, Hitler had slowly moved up almost 24 divisions, many of them armored, more than 250,000 soldiers, and well over 1,000 tanks and assault guns of various types. And they had accumulated a large collection of aircraft too on German airfields that were waiting. including some jet aircraft. And the original hope had been that there would be a lot of jet aircraft, which was something that the Allied air forces couldn't counter. Unfortunately, that for German intentions, that, and fortunately for the Americans, the Germans were unable to accumulate many jet aircraft, but they had perhaps 100 at that point. And these were completely, these were more than 100 miles per hour faster than the fastest piston-powered aircraft. But anyway, on December 16th, 1944, the Germans attacked with this huge force against a very spread out group of American divisions in the Ardennes. There were only a few divisions in the north and only two divisions really in the south, the 28th and the 4th Infantry Division, and in the north, the 99th Division, the 2nd, and the untested 9th Armored Division. The Germans attacked, and it created a ferocious response from the Americans. So the Germans had hoped that they would overwhelm them quickly and they would be on their way to Antwerp. And what actually happened was that there were multiple problems for the German forces that they had not anticipated. They were successful at secretly concentrating the forces. However, the concentration was so heavy and the terrain was so bad in the Eifel and the Ardennes that the tanks and the motorized columns could not deploy off roads. And so there were huge traffic jams at the very beginning of the battle of what was called the Battle of the Bulge, because the Germans burst through the line and actually created a bulge in the line that went all the way. They reached almost to the Meuse River, which was about 50 miles distant from the initial start in the closest place. They reached almost to the Meuse River, but then were counterattacked and then driven back on Christmas Day by the U.S. 2nd Armored Division and the 7th Corps. And also, Hitler had decreed that the attack would only happen under poor weather, and that's what happened. They attacked under poor weather, so the airplanes that they had accumulated, they couldn't even use them. But he knew that the U.S. and British air forces could wreck his attack columns, and so he had attacked under bad weather. Well, anyway, not only was the traffic bad, but the weather was bad. And so the off-road conditions were terrible. So tanks would mire down off roads and trucks couldn't deploy off roads. And then the terrain in the Ardennes was very hilly and difficult to negotiate. And so traffic piled up like mad. And so it was impossible to fully deploy the large collection of German forces that had been accumulated. And so the attack over the first few days was only slow to develop. It did by the third day, by the December 18th, the Germans were able to deploy largely and use their forces, and then did overwhelm the American defenders and surged forward, surrounding the U.S. 101st Airborne Division in Bastogne, on their way to the Meuse River, trying to reach the Meuse River. And then also a German armored battle group under Joachim Peiper, the 1st SS Panzer Division, attacked on the morning of the second day of the operation and pierced through the American lines and reached nearly 30 miles behind American lines, trying to make its way to the Meuse River, but then was surrounded after running out of fuel, and then its supply was cut off, and then it was eventually destroyed. There was a period of time on December 18th through the 21st where the results of the battle appeared like it was in doubt. No one knew what was happening. Everyone was very nervous in Paris, thinking, well, the Germans are coming back again. And it looked like that the Germans were going to cross the Meuse River. That was not all the way to Antwerp. It was only about half of the way there. But then the Allies managed to get their very stubborn, strong airborne divisions, the 82nd Airborne and the 101st Airborne, the 82nd Airborne to block Peiper up in the north, and then the 101st Airborne to resist the German move towards the Meuse River in the south. And this succeeded in slowing the Germans down, and then Patton wheeled his forces from the Lorraine very quickly. In a period of 48 hours, he'd redeployed from the south, moved to attack the Germans south of Bastogne, and then eventually relieved Bastogne, which was surrounded, December 26, 1944, which at about the same time that the U.S. Second Armored Division destroyed the German spearhead of the Second Panzer Division out near the Meuse River. That was really the zenith of the battle. It took another full month of heavy fighting as the Americans brought in more forces, and then the Germans were worn down. Their supply, they only had supply for really about 5 or 6 days of full-scale attack, and then after that they were fighting a poor man's war, essentially. So it took a full month of attack to push the Germans back to the start line, back to where things had begun on the River. And so the campaign ended officially on January 28th, 1945. And the Americans had brought in, by that time, the Germans had brought in 500,000 men to fight in the Bulge. The Americans and the British had brought in 750,000 men that had fought in this battle. And there were approximately 78,000 casualties on the American side, and British casualties were smaller because the British involvement was much lower. It was primarily an American battle, and the German losses were approximately 100,000, perhaps 90,000. The exact numbers are debated. It was a really huge amount of suffering, a lot of losses. It was the largest pitched battle of the Western Front. I think other than D-Day, than Normandy, it was the most famous American battle of the war. And it was, as Churchill said, an ever famous American victory, and it was. So at this point, I think I'm going to stop and then take questions from the audience, and then see if whatever I haven't been able to tell you about that you might want to know more about what the Germans called the Ardennes Offensive and Wacht am Rhein, and what the Americans called the famous Battle of the Bulge. Thank you.
But anyway, Alex, how are things going?
Oh, they're great. I have a fantastic gig with Friends of the World War II Memorial. We're doing great work, and part of my new chapter in life is to get to do this with people like you. And I have to say that I'm really enjoying it, because this season, every month, there's quite a lot of old friends, dear old friends, and people like yourself that I really, really enjoy talking to.
Well, you're one of the great ones, and for those out there who haven't been sold, Mr. Kershaw here is what you should read if you really want to enjoy yourself. He's quite the writer. He can really convey the emotions of what it was like to fight in this great battle 79 years ago. So there's my Alex Kershaw.
Well, in case people think it's just one big boys club, they're dead right, especially this season. But anyway, Danny, can I start by asking you, why have you written so much about the Battle of the Bulge? I mean, you've done it is there any avenue that you haven't taken when it comes to the Battle of the Bulge? What is it about this battle that has fascinated you for decades?
That's I don't really know the answer to that question. I guess, if you're a youth and you decide that you're fascinated by something, then watch out, because it may stick with you for the rest of your life. And so at this point, although I claim I'm a researcher and writer, those are the primary things I do. And I work on some different subjects now. But as a youth, I became really interested in the Battle of the Bulge, and I even did trips during summer vacations in high school to the National Archives to meet George Wagner and try to see if I could look at original records. And one thing led to another. And so I did games on it, and the games were primarily, that may have been a big influence because they were terrible. What I had seen, and I thought, well, this I could do better than that. So I looked at archival sources and realized I could, and then after I came to a much greater understanding, then I was contacted by Charles McDonald, who was at the office of the chief of military history, and he said, "Hey, George Wagner told me that there's this kid who knows a lot about this. Do you mind?" That's when I was a kid, you know. But anyway, and then Charles and I had a marvelous relationship, and then I did tours with Charles, and I worked doing research for him, and then others contacted me and said, you know, you seem to know so much about this. Why don't you write? And so I did. I wrote books, and I started writing books, and then I'd listened to Charles too. He had said to me, you know, I think if you could understand this guy, Joachim Piper, you could understand the entire war. He said that to me over scotches at a really nice restaurant in Luxembourg City. But that stuck with me. And so I looked into that and I realized Charles was right. He was right about most things. But anyway, a really wonderful gentleman who's passed on. And I've been fortunate to have contact with people like Michael Reynolds and many others who have helped. And I'm a research guy. I love to learn things. And so I've really studied this at length. And as long as I'm around, I'll still be studying it.
Well, good. That's great for all of us. I should point out to those who've joined us this morning that Charles McDonald, I'd say he's like probably the finest historian of the battle, other than you, Danny. I just wanted to add that in there. But, you know, A Time for Trumpets is his classic work on the Battle of the Bulge. You can't get a finer study of what it was like to be a company commander than his book, Company Commander. And here's a guy that was actually knew what he was talking about. He's not an academic historian. He's not a journalist like me. He's a guy that actually fought and had command in World War II in the Battle of the Bulge, and then became, one of the finest historians of World War II that we know.
Yeah, he once told me, he said, we were on a tour and we were there and we were talking about what was happening before Rockerath Krinkelt, and they were faced by some Panther tanks that were there at night. He said, you can write about that, but you really don't know how big these things were to be a small man with a rifle facing that. And he said it was a gut experience. You viscerally experienced that, like, I am totally afraid. And these machines are really awful, but it took them out. But, Charles was able to convey what you can convey in your writing, which is the emotions of ordinary men involved in extraordinary events. And like your description of Lyle Balk, so, what Balk did, it was a major deal. It was a major deal in a very big battle. Did it affect the end outcome of the battle? Of course not. But was it? It gave lie to something that Hitler believed. He said that the Americans were the Italians of the Allied alliance, and that was really wrong.
Just to clarify for people, right now, exactly almost to the minute second, Lyle Balk, who you just mentioned, who's the star of my book, The Longest Winter, he's actually being pulled out of a foxhole, shot in the leg, and I think as I'm speaking to you right now, is being pushed down a hillside just above Lanzerath, which is in the Ardennes. And he was the 20-year-old commander of the most decorated platoon of World War II, and intelligence and reconnaissance platoon. And it's, right now in the Ardennes, there is complete chaos, confusion, panic, terror. I wanted to ask you, Danny.
Excuse me for interrupting, but tonight he will meet Joachim Piper, who will show up at the Cafe Palm, where he and his men are being treated for wounds. Yeah. So he will meet a major personality in the Battle of the Bulge this evening.
Yeah, the Joachim Piper, the famous SS leader, probably one of the finest SS, I should say this carefully, SS combat commanders of World War II. Definitely the guy that Hitler entrusted to try and get the job done very early in the battle. one of the things that's really important to stress about the Battle of the Bulge, Danny, is that Battle of the Bulge is the only time, I believe, that American forces were in a situation where the odds were even, where they didn't have the benefit of massive artillery most of the time. They didn't fire 10 times more shells than the Germans. They didn't have air support for almost a week. This was literally mano against mano. At the Germans at their best, the Americans pushed right to the limit. And it's the only time in a large pitched battle, I believe, in all of World War II, where the Americans actually showed that pushed to the limit, they were just as good, if not better. Hence Charles MacDonald's phrase, this was a time to be celebrated to the sound of trumpets. Do you agree with my analysis that this is the one occasion?
I do agree with that, because the Americans were, we are largely individualist, or there's a celebration of the individual. And on the defense, when odds were even, or where odds were actually beyond even, the Germans had more than a 2-to-1 advantage in the initial assault, if you work out the counting rifles thing. So odds weren't even; they were against the Americans. And contrary to Hitler's dictum that the Americans were the Italians of the Allied alliance, the Americans' push to defense turned out to be an extremely formidable foe, because they were used to operating in small groups, small teams, or individuals where, there's a famous statement from an 82nd Airborne guy. He said he drew a line with his boot in the snow, and he said, the line stops here. So, and they really meant that. And so you did not want to face those airborne divisions in battle, because they would fight you tooth and nail. And they were very, very different from this idea that the Americans were weak. The Americans were actually extremely strong. That we were weak with untried divisions, with divisions that had just come up. And this was maybe less true in the German army, because the training was different. But for the Americans, the veteran divisions were fully the equal of any German outfit, and certainly a lot of the weaker German outfits that were in the Bulge, the Volksgrenadier divisions, they were very uneven in terms of their performance and capability. So you're exactly right.
Well, we have a lot of questions.
Okay, well then maybe we should do some of those.
And actually, Danny, I have to say that we have, I think, a record number this year of people watching. So thanks for being with us. You're a draw. So you are definitely. Dave says, my grandfather's battalion, the 634th AAA AW battalion, attached to the 106th ID, ill-fated Golden Lions at St. Vith, were ordered to remove the mechanical stops from their Bofor 40mm guns on the 14th of December. 14th of December, quote, in case of emergency. This allowed the Bofors to be lowered and used against ground targets. So, Dave says, in my opinion, the boots on the ground knew something was coming. Now, before you answer or make a statement, Danny, the big question about the Battle of the Bulge is how on earth, how the hell did the senior Allied command get taken so badly by surprise by over 200,000 German troops? And right at the top, they knew nothing.
They didn't. It is true that on the ground, the 106th Division, for instance, there was a lot of conventional intelligence, because they could hear grinding motors 2 days before the attack to the east, and they could hear unusual sounds. And so there was some concern about that may have had some action taken on the 634th. But the answer to the question was, how were the Allies taken? It again reverts back to this great trust in Enigma. And Enigma had just never been wrong. And Enigma still had lots of material of unimportant things that it was conveying that painted this picture of the German army in not in retreat, but in diminishment. And this is a lesson for us today. So intelligence can be also, while wonderful for military operations and military forces, it can also be a double cross. So one has to be careful about it. That would be my best answer to your questions.
But wasn't it the case that there was also an awful lot of complacency right at the top? And I just wanted to read this to you, Danny. I'm not stealing your thunder too much, but a little bit maybe. So today, as I'm speaking to you, 79 years ago, Allied Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower was this morning a guest at the wedding of his valet in Versailles. Omar Bradley was taking time out to order a custom shotgun. British General Sir Bernard Montgomery, commanding the 21st Army Group, was playing golf and had made plans to return to England to celebrate Christmas, believing the Germans could no longer counterattack in force. That's a pretty dismal picture when you think about what's actually happening on the front line right now in the Ardennes, which is
it's wrong. And it was, and the 12th Army Group with Bradley and at the Hotel Alpha, that's where most of this was coming from, because the G2 there was really painting a picture of the German army just absolutely falling apart. And he would even saying that suddenly they could just fall apart and everyone could just advance.
Right.
It was so bad that the end could come, the collapse could come suddenly. And there was one man in the First Army, Monk Dixon, who didn't trust Enigma, but he knew Enigma. He was getting it. And he said, it's wrong. There's something going on. And then on the 14th of December, I believe that date, it's in one of my books, he said, it's the Ardennes. They're going to attack in the Ardennes. And Hodges and Keane saw to it that he was sent on leave to Paris. They said, he's under too much duress, obviously needs a break. And everyone got tired of him. They said, somebody put a picture of Dixon in the office. They put a picture of Hitler hanging from, and he said, he fools a lot of people some of the time, but he fools Dixon all of the time.
Well,
so Dixon was right. Dixon actually saw that it was the Ardennes. And when it was the Ardennes, he was invited back from Paris. And by that time, the First Army Group was moving from Spa all the way back to Chaude-Fontaine near the Meuse River, because he'd almost had his headquarters overrun by Piper advancing in the Ardennes.
There's so many things that we can talk about, Danny. We don't have very long, but let's talk about the only general, I believe, who comes out of the Battle of the Bulge with real stature, and that's George Patton. And let's also mention the fact that the Third Army staff, Patton's army staff, they're the only ones that have any kind of plan in place for how to react to this massive surprise attack. Let's talk about Patton. Is December 1944, January 1945, are those Patton's finest hours?
They were. And, Patton, of course, was the archetypal warrior. He was a man lost without war. And he was always looking for the big battle, the one that would be his legacy. And it had escaped him at Kasserine, even though there was they prevailed. It had escaped him in multiple instances, and then he was sacked. And then Cobra was nice for him, but he didn't look at that as being his legacy. He looked at his response to the Battle of the Bulge as really being his legacy for what you do. He was the swashbuckling cavalry guy. And actually, I kind of note on both sides that the cavalry officers, the generals, they tended to be more effective. That could be something to study. But anyway, Patton felt that at first, when he saw that in the Ardennes they weren't doing anything, he said, that's a big mistake. They're going to have trouble up there. And they did. But then when they got in trouble, he said, I'll bail their asses out. And so he said he met with Eisenhower and Verdun on I think it was it the 18th or 19th, and they around a
11 o'clock on the 19th.
thank you, around a pot-bellied stove, and Patton said, "I'll wheel my armies. I'll be there in 2 days."
Yeah.
They said, and Eisenhower said, "Don't be fatuous, George. Don't." And he said, "No, I'm serious. I'll be there in 2 days. I'll attack with 4 divisions." So anyway, and he did that. I mean, and his people, they had probably more losses in tanks in the 4th Armored Division moving to the Ardennes than they did fighting in the Ardennes, because it was like, go as fast as you can and be there at the start off line. So it was, and they did rescue Bastogne, and they held Bastogne when Hitler decided that Bastogne must be crushed at the end of December 1944. So it was his finest hour.
So let's boil this down precisely. What was it that Patton did precisely that earned him such everlasting greatness at the Battle of the Bulge?
I think without Patton attacking in the south, the Germans would have reached the Meuse. Now, reaching, the things that viewers probably don't know that I should convey that is maybe the most important thing of what I'll tell you, is the Germans reaching the Meuse around Dinant would not have been too bad. They would have crushed that. The British would have crushed that eventually. The problem was, if the Germans had reached the area around Liège, there were about 20 million gallons of cached gasoline, ammunitions and stocks and rations there that could not be evacuated. And the people in charge of the evacuation said, it can't be done. Maybe we should try to blow it up. You couldn't, because it would set Liège on fire. It was so massive. So that would have delayed the war by months. If the Germans had reached the Meuse around Liège, it would have been a huge, huge disaster. There's an important paper on this by a man named Whipple, but basically it's something that most people don't recognize. It's a very important unknown facet of the Battle of the Bulge. So Patton stopped German progress towards the Meuse River. His attack made it so that the German armies could not concentrate only on the north. They had to face south.
How close did Hitler come to success in this, his last great gamble on the Western Front? How close did he come?
He didn't. I mean, I would say if he had reached those fuel stocks, if Piper had actually pierced there's a really strange thing in that Piper paused on the evening on the 17th when he had a clear way to advance to the Meuse River, and one still doesn't know why. I think that supplies of Pervitin, the stimulant that the German armies were using, had worn down, and everyone was tired, and Piper actually needed a break. But they paused there. If they had not paused there, they might have reached the Meuse River. They might have created trouble with those fuel stocks around Amé and that area, and that could have been a disaster, but it didn't happen. So there were some what ifs. I don't really think he didn't come close to the great reversals that he was looking for. Of course, one can, amateur historians love to come up with what ifs and what ifs and what ifs that would have helped the German army do this and that. There were things, of course, that you could say that were true on the other side, that things could have been done to help circumstances on the American side as well. The investment in trying to save the 106th Division on the Schnee Eifel, a very American idea, probably made it so that the German progress west was helped, because those forces could not. The lines were longer, and those forces couldn't be ignored because the defenders of Saint-Vith themselves came in danger.
So, of course, we have the benefit of hindsight, but if you look at the Allied command, and certainly in the field, the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th of December, there's real panic and concern. So I think if you look at it from the point of view of, even Patton in his diary expresses real concern about this battle going the wrong way.
He said we could still lose this war on 4th January.
Yeah, exactly. And that's, after Christmas of 1944. Quickly, can you tell us about the significance of Bastogne? Why do so many people talk about the Battle of the Bulge and only focus on Bastogne?
I think because it was it was a case where the Germans really surrounded the 101st Airborne. They had them really surrounded. They were surrounded in a vortex of advancing German forces. And then, there were some German divisions, the 15th Panzer Grenadier, that was assigned to help reduce it, take it down. And the Americans resupplied the airborne with C-47s, and so and they fought back valiantly. And then the Germans said, "Well, we have you surrounded." They produced that famous note that came from von Lüttwitz, saying, "We have you surrounded. We know about your humanity. Please surrender, and you'll be treated well." And then McAuliffe says, "Nuts," and it's a very American moment. And not only that, do they say nuts, but then Patton comes in and relieves them on the day after Christmas, and so it's a complete victory for American arms at Bastogne, and it retards the German advance. And then after that, Hitler sees red and decides he wants Bastogne crushed, and is unable to do it by throwing the best forces he has remaining against it. So it was a famous thing. I think actually the American hold on the northern shoulder around Rockerath-Krinkeld is just as important, though, and it's not really recognized. And this is something that McDonald pointed out. It really was a big deal, the defense of Rockerath-Krinkeld. That would have been different if Hitler had attacked on the 10th, because the 101st Airborne wasn't there yet, and the 2nd Infantry Division was on the Schnee Eifel. Wouldn't that have been different? But it didn't happen that way. And that's what the Germans were expecting. They were expecting not to have the 2nd Infantry Division defending Rockerath-Krinkeld.
So what is the impact of the Battle of the Bulge on the Western Front? Does it really doom the Third Reich on the Western Front? Does it deal a very important psychological blow to the average Wehrmacht soldier? Is the war as good as won on the Western Front after the Battle of the Bulge?
There's been a debate on this issue for a long time about all the finest German reserves were used up, and it accelerated the end of the war. And I don't really believe it. I can't find the evidence for that. It did delay all Allied plans in terms of advance for 2 months. So that's a long period of time. And so I don't really see that. If Hitler had succeeded completely in what he wanted to do, that is reaching Antwerp or capturing those large fuel cache around Liège, then it would have won Berlin the atom bomb sweepstakes, I think, and they would have gotten it. And then there's the very strange thoughts that one can have about that. The Emperor Hirohito told everyone, no, we must surrender, but I'm not sure Adolf Hitler would have said that. So, these are history often turns on small events, and the Battle of the Bulge was not an event in World War II, I think, where everything turned on it in terms of changing things. But there were still various items that I mentioned, like Piper's advance and Patton's push and things like that did influence the outcome of the battle, and then perhaps the outcome of the war. But we must not forget that the Russian preponderance on the east really made it so that the Germans had no good options anymore. So,
well, Danny, we're sadly running out of time. I just wanted to say thank you so much for being with us and sharing your expertise and your passion for this subject. We're going to reconvene in about 5 minutes, but I just wanted to have you make one last statement, because today is an important day. It may not be the 80th anniversary, the 75th anniversary, but today is the.
I hope to be around for that one too.
Well, me too. But on the 79th anniversary of the deadliest battle for the US in World War II, what do you think we need to remember? What is worth emphasizing today of all days?
I think that we need to celebrate valor for those before us who they gave great sacrifice to try to protect not only the country that they came from, but also to liberate Europe from tyranny. To me, this was the, if you looked at those films of the French being liberated from the Germans, it was a fine time, fine thing. And then the awful things that were going on where Hitler decided to exterminate undesirables in Poland, this ended. Yep. So, we're going to talk about, we have a witness to Dachau that's coming up. It's going to tell us about that. But so this was a major deal that human beings decided to sacrifice their own life to protect those of us who still live from tyranny and from genocide. So,
as MacDonald said, a time for trumpets, a great tribute to the ordinary American who gave everything, sacrificed everything, in many cases, 19,000 cases, so that others could live in freedom. Thank you, Danny. Please come back and join us again. Lots of great comments. Everyone enjoyed your presentation, and we'll be back in 3 or 4 minutes with, I believe, the finest, most articulate eyewitness to the liberation of the first concentration camp, the most notorious concentration camp in Nazi Germany, Dan Doherty. So please rejoin us at the top of the hour. Thanks so much, Danny, for being with us. Have a great day.
Alex, a pleasure. Thank you.